So today is June 23, 2017, and we'll be continuing on our investigation of the community rule. But before we begin, as always, we'll ask our Heavenly Family to guide us in all things. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for giving us that parental love. Thank you for being so patient with us, and thank you for showing us our errors in such a loving way and guiding us to see that reality in many ways is better than we realized. Mm-hmm. So please help us, Heavenly Family, to have the love for each other that you have for us. Help us to become that people that is known by our loved one for another, to demonstrate that you came, brother, and why you came. So help us to understand your love. Help us to gain an experience of your love. And help us to do all things according to truth, not according to falsehood. Thank you so very much. Sister, guide us as we continue this investigation. We ask this, B'Shem Tzemach Hu Hi, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we'll follow our threefold pattern for community rule studies. First, recapping what the community rule is, why it's important, our methods of investigating it. Second, comments and questions broadly related to the subject. And third, the line-by-line investigation of the community rule itself. So first, what is the community rule? Well, it is a text that was written in the first part of the 2nd century BCE in the Hebrew language by a Jew or a group of Jews representing the beliefs and practices and mission of the community of Jews within which it was written. This is a writing which was lost to history starting in about the year 68 of the Common Era, just a couple years before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus and the Roman armies. And it remained unknown until its discovery in 1946 to 1947. The exact date of its discovery is not known because it was first discovered by Bedouin, and it may have been in the winter of 1946, but it did not come into the hands of archaeologists or paleographers, various scholars that deal with Israel, Judaism, the Hebrew language, and so on, until 1947. And at that point, it was recognized for what it is, an ancient Jewish text from, again, the early part of the 2nd century BCE. And from that time till this, it has been recognized, at least among scholars of the subject, to be a central document for understanding the Dead Sea Scrolls and their importance. So, why is this text so important? Well, first, as I mentioned, it tells us a lot about the community within which it was written. So anyone interested in that community will naturally be interested in the community rule. And one thing to keep in mind with the community rule is that the words that are used for the title in Hebrew, Serek, ha-yahad are not talking about the rules of the community, or like the community mandate, or something like that. It is talking about the general rule or the general principle by which the community operates. So it's more like a manifesto. In fact, some scholars have referred to it as a manifesto or a charter of a Jewish group in the late Second Temple period. And so, yeah, it's not primarily concerned with do's and don'ts. It is primarily concerned with ideology and practice. And along with that, out of the 11 columns of the best preserved copy of the community rule, known as 1QS, only 2 columns are really more so dealing with not even necessarily rules, but consequences for breaking rules, which of course inadvertently lets you know what certain of the rules were. So 2 out of 11 columns do have a concern with that sort of thing, like more of a legal type aspect. But it's not primarily a legal text or anything like that. So, again, really important for understanding the community itself. But for most of us today, we might not think that that is important, because we might think of the community represented by the community rule as just kind of an offshoot group of Jews who were really insignificant, had little impact on history, and certainly not relevant for anything we think and talk about today. Such an approach would be a mistake, to say the least. The Qumran community was not just simply kind of like an offshoot group of Jews or anything like that. It's true that they did not represent the majority, but no group that anyone can mention represented the majority. There was really no such thing in those days as Orthodox Judaism or normative Judaism. In fact, most scholars of the Second Temple period recognize that it isn't really that accurate to refer to Judaism in that time. In fact, more accurately, one would refer to Judaisms. But some scholars even go further to say that you can't really talk about Judaism as a religion at all in that period. So there's one scholar in particular named Daniel Boyarin, and he has gone through the evidence dealing with the term Judaism, and in all Jewish literature from ancient times, apparently the only place where the word shows up is in the book known as 2nd Maccabees. And in 2nd Maccabees, in using the word Judaism, and in Greek it's Judaismos, it's not using it to refer to a religion. It's using it to refer to the way that the national people, the Jews, do things, or the idea, at least, of Jews doing things a certain way that is recognized as being Jewish. And so it wasn't like you have Judaismos and I'm trying to remember the parallel for Christianity, but you don't have Judaism and Christianity that are talked about in the same sort of way. You have things like Judaismos and if I remember how to pronounce it correctly, it's like Athanesmos, which is like to do what Athenians do, people from Athens. Romanesmos, what do Romans do? To do things how Romans do. So it's used to describe the way of behaving that is Jewish in contrast with the way of behaving that is Roman or Grecian or particularly Athenian, or, it could be like the people of a city, are kind of known for doing things in a certain way. And so the Jews are known for doing things in a certain way. And so with that in mind, one must question whether there was anything which we would identify as a religion of Judaism back in the Second Temple times. Now, of course, there are elements of what it was to be a Jew that we would recognize and call religious. But these are our modern categories. These are not the categories that they would use. And so I just mentioned this to kind of talk a little bit about the complexity of the world represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the community rule, and to keep in mind that, of course, we have our own perspectives. We have our own way of categorizing the world. And naturally, when we approach anything, we attempt to categorize it according to the categories that we have. In fact, we can't really do anything else unless and until we are informed that there is something else. And this is why it's so important to thoroughly study the time and place which we focus on. And so if we're studying the community rule, we have to study the time and the place of the community rule and take note of the differences between that world and our world. And one of the differences is the fact that they, in that world, did not categorize things the same way we do in our world. We think of politics and religion and education and philosophy and science, and we view these things as relatively separate domains, even though, of course, we recognize that they all interact with each other, but still, we have politics and then we have religion, and they're different things. In the ancient world, it was really not so much like that. A good example is the pharaohs. The pharaohs were the head of government, but they were also the head of religion. They were divinized. There was no such thing as a interfaith country, in a sense. What you had was a nation, and that nation had its national religion. So, today, let's take the United States of America. Being an American is one thing, but being an American does not have a religious implication. It does not mean that you are a certain religion because you are an American. And if you go to another part of the world and say that you are an American, people will not automatically assume that you are one religion or another. Perhaps they'll say, maybe Christian is most likely because out of the religions in the United States, that is the most common. But still, it's not like a given, and it's not like saying American equates to a particular religious dogma or belief or orientation or anything like that. In the ancient world, it was not so. If you were an Egyptian, it had an automatic religious connotation to it, or at least what we would call a religious connotation to it. If you went somewhere as an Egyptian, people would automatically assume and probably rightly, that you worshipped Ra and that you had the beliefs of other Egyptians in regard to divine beings and in regard to all the other things that we today might classify as being religious. Likewise, if you were from Babylon and you went somewhere, it's not like you went to, if you went from Babylon to Egypt and an Egyptian asked you, "Oh, you're from Babylon? Oh, okay, that's great. Tell me more about you. What religion do you have? Do you believe in this God or that God or what?" No, most likely what it would be is, "Oh, you're from Babylon. Okay, we know that you revere Marduk as your chief god." And when I say believe in, even in that context, it's not like the people from one nation rejected the existence of the gods of another. It's just that they were loyal to the gods of their nation over the gods of other nations, even though, hey, if they were there in another nation, of course they would worship the God while they're there. They would pay homage to that God, just like people of other nations did to Yahweh when they went to Israel. But that's because they're gods, and that's just what humans are supposed to do to gods. Humans are supposed to pay homage to gods and honor gods and worship gods because you want to be on the good side of as many gods as you can be. You don't want to disrespect any god, and they're the bigger, more powerful beings, and so you better worship them. And that's why Jews were always viewed as disrespectful, because when they went to other nations, they wouldn't pay homage to those gods, and it came across rude, because that's just the thing that you do. So, it's kind of like sports teams. People of a certain area, it's basically automatic that if they're into sports, they are going to root for the team in their area. That's just the way it is, and that's how it was with gods. People would root for their local gods, so to speak. Why? Because they believed that their gods were the ones controlling their particular economy, their particular government, and if their gods go down, well, their economy goes down, their government goes down, and they don't want that. So that's the world that we have to picture when we are considering things like the community rule or any of these ancient texts. They didn't have the same world that we do. Their world was very different. And the community rule and all of the other texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls are a very important glimpse into that world. And of course, our world developed out of that world. And so if we want to understand our world and the reason why people often have the assumptions that they do, it is very important to understand the world from which we emerged. Yes, it's very different, but it's hard to understand something without a context. And that world provides a context for this world. That's one of the reasons why it is so important. Another reason is because there is a direct relationship between texts like the community rule and other writings found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament and the early followers of Jesus and indeed Jesus himself. Now, no one can deny that if that is the case, it is certainly important. At least it's important for us because our world has been very immediately and recognizably shaped by the ideas and practices put forward by Jesus, his followers, and those who adulterated the teachings and practices of Jesus and his followers. So, the community rule, in fact, has many direct and unique parallels with the writings of the early followers of Jesus. Now, by direct, I mean you can take a passage in the community rule and sit it side by side with a passage in the New Testament or other writings of the early followers of Jesus. So whether it's the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Odes of Solomon, the Gospel of John, some of the letters of Paul, whatever it may be, you can sit side by side the community rule and these other writings and find passages that are remarkably similar, not only in their ideas, but also in their wording, to the point where you would have to say there is at least an allusion, not illusion with an I, but allusion with an A, to the community rule from the writings of the early followers of Jesus. Even more so, you could go as far as to say that there are places where there are short quotations from the community rule. To even take it a step further, some scholars say that the author of the Gospel of John had at least portions of the community rule memorized. No matter what, it was clearly in some way heavily influential upon the early followers of Jesus. So that's the way in which it directly relates. I also said that it uniquely relates. The reason why I say uniquely is because several, or many even, of these passages where there is a strong parallel between the community rule and writings of the early followers of Jesus, it is the only parallel. As in, it's not that you have, let's say, the Gospel of John, which parallels the community rule, and a passage in Isaiah. Now, there are places like that, but that isn't so strong to show that John was influenced by the community rule, because John could have been just influenced by Isaiah if they all three share that same parallel. The exception to that would be in an instance where John departs from Isaiah within his parallel to Isaiah in a direction that goes toward the community rule. So, like, let's say if you have Isaiah and the community rule and John, and they all say something very similar, but when the community rule says something that's based on Isaiah, it changes it or departs from it in some very specific and characteristic way. If John also parallels Isaiah, but the parallel is closer to the community rule, departs from Isaiah in the same very specific ways as the community rule, well, then it shows some sort of connection. But even more specifically, are instances where John and the community rule parallel one another with no third source involved. In other words, well, there's John and there's the community rule, and there's no parallel in Isaiah or Daniel or Genesis or Enoch or any other text at all. That's where you have something a lot more substantial, where you can show, yes, this is definitely direct and unique. So there is indeed a genuine relationship between the documents, and where the latter document depends upon the former. So this sort of thing happens. You have this sort of relationship between the community rule and several of the writings among the early followers of Jesus. That should be important for anyone interested in Jesus, his teachings, the followers of Jesus, their teachings, the practices advocated by them, the development of Christianity subsequent to Jesus and his early followers, the impact that all of those various movements have had upon the modern world, all of that is impacted by the community rule. Just the same as if you read the book of Revelation and you wonder, oh boy, this is really odd. I wonder where this guy got this stuff. Well, if you don't study the book of Daniel, you are going to miss it. You are definitely going to end up misinterpreting Revelation to whatever degree, because it is, to a certain degree at least, basing itself upon Daniel. So, to whatever degree the authors of the writings that were produced by the early followers of Jesus, to whatever degree they depended upon the community rule, to that degree we are likely to misinterpret their writings without having the community rule at our disposal and indeed of it. And so without the community rule, again, we are going to misunderstand the writings of the early followers of Jesus, at least to some degree. Now, that should be important for anyone who cares about Jesus and his teachings and so on. But it's even more specific than that, as I've mentioned on many occasions now in these recaps as to what the community rule is and why it is important. The community rule is also highly significant because it captures some of the teachings of the founder of that movement, that is the movement of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, that individual is known as the teacher of righteousness. And he either wrote some or all of the community rule, or at minimum, his ideas are contained within the community rule. We know this to be the case because we have some of his writings which may precede the community rule, and which certainly do precede it if the community rule was written after the life of the teacher of righteousness. And we are able to compare what the community rule says with what the writings which we know to be a product of the teacher of righteousness say. And we can see for sure that the community rule contains some of the unique ideas of the teacher of righteousness. Now, why does the teacher of righteousness matter to us? Was he just a false prophet from a couple hundred years before Jesus? Well, as we have discovered, that is certainly not how Jesus viewed him. Nor is it how John the Baptist viewed him, nor is it how James viewed him. Likewise with Paul, John, Peter, and all of the early followers of Jesus. In fact, we can show that the early followers of Jesus, including Jesus himself, knew who the teacher of righteousness was. They were familiar with this character and with at least some of his writings and the ideas taught by him, as evidenced by the awareness of the community rule which is exhibited in the early Nazarene writings. Nazarene, of course, being the name used by the early followers of Jesus for themselves. And we also know that they had and used and considered to be very important the thanksgiving hymns which were written by the teacher of righteousness. So we know that they knew who he was. We know that we knew his ideas and so on. Because of that, we can actually study how they viewed him. And the way that we do that is by seeing how they treat the ideas which were unique and original to him. And invariably, the results are that they advocate, promote, and build upon the unique and original teachings of the teacher of righteousness. And not only that, they consider those teachings to be even central rather than something peripheral. For example, the teaching of the two ways. You have the way that leads to life and the way that leads to death. You have the broad path and the narrow path. The teaching of the two ways was indeed one of the central teachings of the early followers of Jesus. In the Didache, it says that that is the teaching in which those entering into the Nazarene community are to be instructed prior to their entering into the community by means of a ritual immersion, known more commonly as baptism. Now, that's pretty significant in and of itself, especially since the Didache is recognized to go back to the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era. This is, of course, while the apostles are still alive. This is while James, the brother of Jesus, was leading the Nazarene movement. So the Didache is a very important witness to what they believed and taught, and the teaching of the two ways is a central part of that. And that teaching is directly based upon, in fact, it is even the same teaching as the teaching of the two ways, or the two spirits, found in the teachings of the teacher of righteousness, and perhaps most vividly and fully explained in the community rule. So all of this just highlights the importance of the community rule. Now, understanding what the community rule basically is and why it's so important, how do we go about studying the community rule in such a way that will cause us to arrive at accurate and meaningful conclusions? Well, the very first thing that we need to do is carefully study it in order to understand what it authentically says. What I mean by that is that we need to be careful while reading it not to misinterpret it, not to take it as saying something other than what the author or authors of the text originally intended it to say. And in order to do that, we need to approach it carefully. We need to approach bias. We need to recognize the differences between our world and the world in which the community rule was written, which is kind of the sort of thing that I was mentioning earlier, or at least what I was mentioning earlier is a part of that element. And we need to develop a thorough knowledge of its actual contents. So that's the first thing that we need to do. And when we do that, of course, we can study its relationship to other writings which preceded it and also which came after it. So we can say, okay, like, for example, it definitely has a relationship to Isaiah. So how does it relate to Isaiah? It definitely has a relationship to the Gospel of John and the Didache and some of these other texts that I've mentioned. Okay, well, how does it relate to those texts? That's important to find out as well. But in understanding what it says on its own, the next step that we really want to take is to understand which of its claims are unique claims, or perhaps I'll rephrase this in order to distinguish more clearly. Which of its statements are unique claims? And which of its statements are not really even a point that it's trying to make, but maybe incidental to the ideas it is trying to put forward. And thus, assumed realities rather than proposed realities. Assumed knowledge rather than claimed insight. And what we want to do is test the claimed insight, the proposed reality, the unique and original claims put forward, the ideas being set forth by the author or authors. We want to test those claims to see whether they correspond with reality. If they do correspond, then we will say that what the community rule puts forward is true. If they do not correspond, then we will say that what it puts forward is not. And of course, if it has a mix of true claims and false claims, then we will acknowledge the true and we will dismiss the false. But one of the things that we want to do is find out whether it claims to be a product of divine inspiration. Because if it does make that claim, then presumably what it claims is that all of the unique ideas set forth therein are in fact true, and that none of the unique ideas set forth therein are false. Now, if that is its claim, then in order to test the self-consistency or lack thereof of its claim to divine inspiration, we need to test whether all of its claims, all of its unique claims are true, or whether only some or none of them are true. And that would give us an indication as to its legitimacy in claiming divine inspiration if it does make that claim. In other words, if it claims divine inspiration, but some or none of its unique and original claims are true, then it fails at evidencing that it is a product of divine inspiration. In fact, by its own self-inconsistency, it would demonstrate that it is not a product of divine inspiration. Now, on the other hand, if it does claim to be a product of divine inspiration and all of its claims are true, and especially if we find insight, unique insight into the things which the divine message is supposed to be about, well then that is strong evidence in favor of the authenticity of the claim to divine inspiration. So we're definitely interested in that. So that's the basic approach that we have to this text, and that's how we have been approaching it, and I believe that our studies have been immensely fruitful, not only in coming to understand the community rule, not only in coming to understand the Dead Sea Scrolls as a whole, and the Jesus movement and the history of the period, but also in coming to understand very important principles such as the nature of morality and the solution to immorality, the contrast between truth and falsehood, the nature of truth and falsehood, and also the nature of humanity in terms of our way of thinking and behaving. So this is kind of like a pre-psychology and a not pre-philosophy. Philosophy, of course, came before this, but the science of psychology, of course, did not come into existence until modern times, but this has elements of, what we might call psychology. So it's a proto-psychology. It has immense insights into the workings of the human mind. So that's essentially it for our kind of first phase of looking at the community rule tonight. So we can now go into comments and questions on the community rule or broadly related to the community rule. And as I've explained in previous studies, I say broadly related to the community rule in order to highlight the fact that we want to be still related. We don't want to go off on totally other topics because we want to stay focused and really kind of get to the bottom of this with the community rule. But I say broadly because it doesn't have to be on a specific passage in the community rule or anything like that. It could be about, our methods of study. It could be about the history of the Qumran community or the early followers of Jesus in relationship to the community rule or the movement which it represents. Any of these kind of more broadly related yet still related subjects. So that said, does anyone have any such comments or questions?
I do have a question. When testing the unique claims of an author, is there ever a possibility that a unique or inspired claim could be wholly dung? It seems to me that wholly dung is like allowed falsehood for the purpose of withholding information we're not ready for. So my question really is wholly dung ever on a unique inspired claim, or is that never the case?
Okay, that is an excellent question. So part of this has to do with how we define our terms. When I say claim in this context, I am referring to not just a statement. And that's why at first I said claim, and then I said, no, I'm going to rephrase this in order to be more, or have more distinction. So let's identify a claim as not only a statement, but an idea that is being set forth, like a point that is being made by the individual. A statement may be there that is related in some way to that point, but may not be an expression of that point itself. It may be somewhat peripheral to the point in order to illustrate whatever that may be. So I want to distinguish those two things very clearly first. So with that understanding, the unique claims of a true prophet will never be false. There may be statements which are not original to the prophet, In other words, just a repeated idea, which may be false. And there it's, it can be an idea expressed in a statement that is simply a common understanding of the day, and that is not really the thing upon which to test the legitimacy of a prophet. So, for example, Ellen White, there was an instance where she repeated the number of rooms in a building, and she had gotten the number of rooms from a brochure, but the brochure had it incorrect. There was actually like one more room or something like that. And someone stumbled over that and said, well, Ellen White said that this building had, X number of rooms, and it turns out it was something different. So, she's a false prophet, obviously. She said the number of rooms wrong. Well, come on, that's not at all even related to her message. She's going off the information she had in a brochure. It's not an idea unique and original to her or anything like that. And so, therefore, that's an instance where you can have something that's quote-unquote wholly done. It's statements made by inspired messengers that are to be passed off. Like, it's not to be something that's kept and retained forever, and it's something that's supposed to be passed off as waste. But it's totally fine in terms of inspiration for it to be there. So the Spirit works with that. So therefore, holy cow, holy done. That's the idea. Now, there is another element of the quote-unquote holy dung, which doesn't have to do with unique claims of a prophet, but it has to do with unique statements. And of course, when I say this, we can only say what is unique based off of the available or the known information. So let's say we want to find out, let's say there's a statement that Victor Houteff makes, and we want to know, is this a unique statement? Well, we can only assess that based off of what we know and have available to us. But maybe there was somewhere where Victor Houteff heard something, and it was just totally oral from someone who he knew, and no one ever wrote down that idea, and he happened to be the first person who wrote it down, but he didn't really originate the statement. And that's possible, but we would never know. So far as we can tell, he originated the statement. So I'll give you an example. There's a place where Victor Houteff says that there were not sacrifices, animal sacrifices, on the seventh-day Sabbath. Sabbath sacrifices. I don't know of any other author who makes a statement like that. Perhaps there is one. And perhaps Victor Houteff got it from someone else. Or perhaps there isn't one, and he was the first one to write it down, but maybe he heard it from like a friend of his orally, and it wasn't original to him. Or another possibility is that in his reading of the Bible, the reference, it doesn't talk about it much, but perhaps it just missed his attention, and he either forgot or just didn't realize that, hey, actually there in Numbers 28, it does talk about specific sacrifices to be offered on the seventh-day Sabbath. So it could be just the frailty of his own mind. Not everyone has a complete understanding of something. So it could be just his lack of understanding of the subject, and that he really thought that was the case because, hey, he had read through the Bible however many times, and in attempting to recall whether there were any sacrifices on the seventh-day Sabbath, he could not recall any. And perhaps he even looked and couldn't find any. Remember, they didn't have the digital, computerized searching tools that we have today. And, it can be hard to find things just looking through, a library like the Bible. And so it could be that he just did not have, the information in front of him and didn't recall ever having read it, and so he made the statement that there were no sacrifices on the Sabbath. And perhaps he was the first one to say or think that. But that isn't the point that he's trying to make. He's not trying to make a point out of, there was no sacrifices on the Sabbath and all of that, and making a doctrine out of it or anything like that. It's peripheral to the broader subject he was discussing. I'm forgetting now if this was in Shepherd's Rod Volume 1 or 2, but I do believe it was in one or the other. So, there are instances where a prophet can just have their own personal misunderstandings of some particular. And thus it is a unique statement to the prophet, but it is not a claim. Like, if the person was to be challenged on it, they might say, hey, I could be misunderstanding this. That's not really my main point anyway, whatever. So there are certainly instances like that, and that can be, or that is included in what we identify as being holy dung. So does that answer your question?
Yes, that's very interesting. Okay, so it's claims versus statements. I get what you're saying. I guess I would say I don't know if I would be good enough at differentiating between what's a unique claim. I understand your point. I understand that a statement is just a statement that's supplementary to their claim. It's not necessarily a claim. I get it, but I'm afraid that I wouldn't be able to differentiate it probably as well as you could. But anyway, that's why we're here.
That's interesting what you say, Mary, because you're right. We wouldn't necessarily be able to differentiate all those things, which is why we're told by Victor Houteff, actually, that if there's something that we don't understand in an author's writing, we should either ask that person directly, what did you mean when you wrote this? And if they're not living, then we should either, the word's escaping me, but go to their writings themselves or to, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that what he says is that if the prophet is live, then you ought to ask the prophet. But if they are dead, then the only way to find the answer is to inquire from the same spirit who investigated the prophet through a further manifestation.
Right. So we're promised to have a living person as a spokesperson for that same inspiring spirit for the rest of the branch message, are we not?
Repeat that, please.
Are we promised to have a continual living prophet in the branch?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So we're not even required, or it's not like we're without the opportunity and ability to find out, unless it's just of our own ability. No, we don't have to even try to figure it out ourselves without being able to have a source to go to inquire.
Now, I do have to clarify something.
I hope you can make sense of what I'm trying to say. You can rephrase it for me.
Yeah, I think, but there's one aspect where I think you may actually have a slight misunderstanding on something. I'm not totally sure, but it's, okay, so it is not actually the case in an ultimate sense that we are unable to distinguish between the peripheral statements and the main ideas set forth by an inspired writer unless we have a later writer to explain it to us, a later inspired messenger. I understood this principle of a distinction between ideas and statements prior to being called to bear a message myself. And it had to do with a statement that Victor Houteff makes in the Symbolic Code, Volume 1, Number 4. No, sorry. The Symbolic Code, Volume 1, I guess it is Number 4, and I think it's page 1. Number 4, page 1. I may be wrong on the reference, but I believe that is the place. If not, it is very close to there, probably just page 2 or 3 or something like that. Anyway, in this place, Victor Houteff says that basically we hold that the shepherd's rod, the contents of the shepherd's rod are true. The message is true insofar as the ideas put forth are concerned. Now, at first when I read that, there was something about it that I didn't like because he qualified it. And I wanted to just say the contents of the shepherd's rod are free from error, period. Not free from error insofar as the ideas set forth are concerned, because what's that supposed to mean? Because when I first heard that, I was thinking the same thing, and perhaps even to a greater degree that you're saying, Mary. I was thinking, how am I supposed to distinguish? Because every statement is said to convey an idea. There's no such thing as an idealist statement. So how am I supposed to distinguish between the ideas set forth and what Victor Houteff refers to as incidental statements? I thought, oh man, this is just impossible. So I didn't really like it, and I didn't allow myself to really contemplate that question too much, because I just wanted to be able to say, I'm going to open up the Shepherd's Rod writings, I'm going to read it, and every single statement that is there must be 100% pure truth. But then why does Victor Houteff say, insofar as the ideas are concerned? And I didn't want to have to contemplate that question. And why did he say that prophets make statements that are incidental and can be erroneous and all of these different things? And, it just seemed way too complicated. And I was like, I couldn't deal with it. But I realized that I had to deal with it, and so I started to compile a bunch of statements from Victor Houteff on topics like this. And reading Holy Cow, Holy Dung really answered my dilemma, because it helped me to understand the difference between the ideas set forth and incidental statements. It helped me to understand how to distinguish between the message being fully true and truly the ideas set forth being free from error, and yet those ideas being embedded within the expressions which are fallible expressions of a particular human being. And so that really, really helped me. And then at that point, I began to at least practice, not saying flawlessly, but practice distinguishing between the ideas set forth by a prophet or even anyone and just the statements. Now, when I say or anyone, that is actually a very helpful aspect. And keep this in mind, because here's the thing. Part of the reason why we have a difficult time distinguishing between incidental statements and the ideas set forth, the points being made, is because of our expectation that when we read the writings of a prophet, every statement, every word, every syllable, every character is from God, and thus the inspired, authoritative, eternal truth. When when we come with that expectation, yeah, it's hard to distinguish. But you know what? That's not how we do it with anyone else. We don't really enter into a conversation with someone and have the approach to the conversation of saying, well, any statement that they make, I am holding them to it, no matter what, because what they say is either all right or all wrong. No, we don't have that view when it comes to talking with people. We may talk to them, and someone may mistakenly say something and then clarify it, and we say, oh, okay. Or they may mistakenly say something, but we understand, oh, well, that's not really their main point anyway, so that's not a big deal. Or like, let's say there's something that you know a lot about, and you're talking to someone who knows less about that subject than you do, and they're trying to express something about the subject, and kind of like the main point that they make is right, but the way that they express it, they get some things wrong. Like, let's just say if I'm talking to Ed about printing, or you, Mary, about printing, and I am trying to convey a certain idea, and I say something, and maybe my basic point, like, yeah, I'm getting the idea right, basically, but I may use the wrong term to refer to something, or say, have a misunderstanding of how something works or whatever. Well, in talking to me, it's not like you hold me accountable to that. You get the difference. You know what I'm basically trying to say, and you recognize that that's different from my misunderstandings and my partial understandings in attempting to say it. So if we just apply that same principle that we use when talking to anyone else or in reading the writings of anyone else, like we read someone's blog, like a friend of ours, let's say, and they have a blog and we read it, or someone wrote an article, we understand that difference. All we really have to do is apply that to reading the writings of any of these individuals. So what's important to recognize is, most people, when they read the Bible, they ignore the author and they take it as the words of God, as though God wrote it. That's not how we should read the Bible. That's not how we should read any of the writings of the Bible, because that's not what they claim to be. They claim to be the words of the authors. And so we need to read it as from another human being and try and understand it as from another human being, but with the understanding that if we're reading that they're claiming that the ideas which they're conveying, like the points that they're getting across, didn't originate with them, that they are points which they got from the Holy Spirit or from God. And so that's what we need to test. And so it's the ideas that are really the central point. And for someone who acknowledges the inspiration of a particular messenger, that is where the authority is. It's in the ideas. It's not in the particular statements. It's not in the way that the ideas are expressed. It's in the ideas themselves. So that's what we really have to do. Read these writings as from individuals, but recognizing or identifying their claim, and if they do make a claim to divine inspiration, and if we can determine that that claim is correct, then we ought to understand that, yes, the ideas set forth are true. But we do have the capability as individuals, without needing to depend on the next messenger to explain it to us, to distinguish between incidental statements and points or ideas set forth. And in fact, we have to do that without relying on the next messenger, as it were, because making that distinction is part of what we have to do in order to test whether that individual is a prophet, because you need to know what you're even testing. If you can't distinguish between the peripheral statements and the points being made, you may be testing them on the peripheral statements, and if they make a peripheral statement that is false, you may conclude that they are false, and then you won't even be in the line to meet the next prophet to help you understand it. So that's really important to keep in mind. Now, and that's where there may have been some level of actual difference in what Teresa was saying and what I'm saying, but what Teresa was saying still does have application, and this is where it has application. Let's say you're in the position of where all of us at least have been, and where perhaps all of you are, and that is being in a place where you are studying, perhaps even for the first time, the writings of messengers that are now past. While you acknowledge the claims of a present messenger and may be having difficulty grasping these principles and applying them, now, in a place like that, you may, in a certain instance, find yourself unable to distinguish between just a peripheral statement and an idea. It's not that you are inherently unable, but perhaps you're just having a hard time at that point. Well, at that point, it's something that's unclear to you, and you can inquire. And so then, like, let's say, you have a question about, okay, what's the basic idea in this particular passage in the writings of Victor Houteff? Is this particular statement peripheral, or is it a main point? And you're really having a hard time, grasping that in that particular instance. Well, yeah, you could ask me, and I may have the answer. I may be able to help you. And if I don't have the answer for that particular incident, maybe it's because I've never considered it before, or whatever it may be. Well, I'll have the principles whereby we can, go and examine it together in order to distinguish, whether it is just a peripheral statement or a point that Victor Houteff was trying to make. So hopefully that helps to the whole thing.
Well, while I freely admit that I in no way come close to understanding all the points of the message or principles even of the message, I think the main misunderstanding I was having was or maybe it wasn't even a misunderstanding, but just my mind jumped to a slightly different aspect of what Mary was saying, because my point was, thank God we don't have to rely on trying to figure everything out for ourselves in this message.
Exactly.
That's why, I've referenced, if you don't understand what a messenger was saying, you could say, what did you mean by this? And if they're not alive, then, you can still have access to the same spirit to explain it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, both of your comments really helped me. Both of them did. So I really, really thank you, even Teresa, for helping me with that part of it. And Trent, yeah, that's very clear. Now, one more question on that subject, not to hog the whole thing, but just
sure.
On the same topic. Okay, so like Ellen White will say, okay, so if you're trying to figure out if someone is an inspired messenger, like, say, the teacher of righteousness, now but let me just take Ellen White as a better example, the one that I can relate to better. So when she says a lot of times in her writings, I was shown, well, there she's claiming inspiration, okay? And I know we're looking for those type of statements in other people's writings, other, potential prophets' writings. But once she is a prophet, then she doesn't have to always say, I was shown. Like, then I would just take any of her published works as being inspired, even if she doesn't say, I was shown, and then I could test those unique claims. Like, basically what I'm saying is in any of Ellen White's writings, I could test her unique claims. Once she's a prophet, then she's a prophet.
Right. So here's the thing. You are correct in saying that it's not just all, every time that she says, I was shown. It's also many, many times where she does not say, I was shown, but she is setting forth the principles of the message which she was given to bear. Now, so when you see I was shown versus not seeing that, it's not that she's saying it because she's trying to distinguish between things that she was given by inspiration and things that she was not given, when she doesn't make the statement that she just wasn't given it by inspiration. What she is doing is she makes those statements, I was shown, when she is writing or speaking to people who acknowledge her to be a prophet. She doesn't make those statements when she's writing for the general public. In her books that are written for non-Adventists, she does not say, I was shown. Why? Because that doesn't mean anything to them. They don't acknowledge her as a prophet. So she makes those statements when she's speaking to people who acknowledge her prophetic gift and when she is holding them accountable to be consistent in their acknowledgement. So like if someone is tempted to ignore the message that she is giving them, like particularly like if it's a rebuke or something like that, or if it's a point which someone is likely to be tempted to not accept even doctrinally or whatever, then she makes the statements like, I was shown, because she's, again, holding them accountable to consistency. She's trying to say, if you are going to acknowledge that I am a prophet, you must acknowledge this point. If you refuse to acknowledge this point, you must also refuse to acknowledge that I am a prophet. She's trying to say, this is important, and if you claim to believe this message, you have to acknowledge this. Otherwise, you should have nothing to do with it, because in order to be consistent, if you say that this is false, you should say that I am a false prophet altogether. So that's the point of those statements. So, yeah, I think you are certainly understanding it correctly.
Oh, okay, that's very, very helpful. And I can just see how, holy cow, holy dung is just obviously a critical thing to understand. But it also, Satan can really use it to tempt you, also to possibly question maybe more than you should. Basically what you're saying helped me a lot in that area. Thank you.
Right. It's very important principle, and you're right, and I kind of want to elucidate that a bit further. Yeah, I mean, it's the whole typical thing that pastors say of, and Ellen White, I'm pretty sure, has said this too, the devil doesn't care which ditch he drags you down into, he wants to drag you into one ditch or the other. So on one hand, people have a tendency to idolize the statements and words of prophets and raise them up to be infallible when they are not. On the flip side, there's also a tendency to dismiss the ideas set forth by prophets. And when someone acknowledges them to be a prophet and yet understands their individual fallibility, it can be tempting to ignore the points they're trying to make and just, basically say, oh, well, this is just one of their their mistakes. They don't really know me and all of that. So, and this has really been the downfall of many people. To reject the points being made by a prophet simply because the prophet is not infallible. And they may even still claim to believe that the person was a prophet. But the point is that the ideas, the points being made by the prophet is what the prophet claims to be of divine origin. And so if you are receiving a rebuke through inspiration, or I'll say if you are receiving a rebuke from someone who is a prophet of God, or who claims to be a prophet, that is claimed to be part of their message. And I'll just say this directly. If I rebuke any of you, that rebuke, the claim is that that rebuke is part of the divinely inspired message. And to reject that rebuke, in order to be consistent, you should reject the message as a whole. And if you acknowledge the message as a whole, and you are rebuked, and you feel resistance to that rebuke, you should be aware of your own bias, your own pride, and your own potential blindness to the truth of the rebuke, because the points concerning which we often need a rebuke are the points which we are often less likely to see. And, there are some of you who I have never given a direct rebuke to, which I am so grateful for. It's not to say that you're necessarily free from a need of rebuke, but perhaps you are able, our Heavenly Family is able to communicate it to you without needing to use me to give you a rebuke. That's something which I celebrate and which should be celebrated.
And there's also the occasion where a person, it wouldn't do them any good because they're not willing to hear it at all. And so our Heavenly Family knows, okay, if I were to offer this correction to you or this rebuke, there's no chance of it helping you. So I won't do it yet. I'll try means of getting your attention, getting you ready for the rebuke, and then hopefully you'll receive it, and I'll try later.
Sure.
Because I can see the potential for someone who isn't ready to receive a rebuke, and they hear that, oh, you're really happy you haven't had to rebuke some people. Well, I haven't received a rebuke.
Right.
That means I don't need one.
Right. Oh, exactly. It doesn't mean that someone is not in need of rebuke just because they haven't received one. It could be that our Heavenly Family is able to correct them without using me, or it could be that if they were to use me, it wouldn't do any good anyway. And you might not know yet if that's the case for you or not. It's important not to be too self-confident. To be self-distrustful in a circumstance like that.
And, I can definitely see where it might even be the preferable method of our Heavenly Family to not use their messenger to give the rebuke all the time. They would prefer to just have the person figure it out, to recognize it through other means, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. That would be better.
For many reasons.
Yeah.
One reason is just that it is more helpful for the individual sometimes to be able to go through their corrective process without another person involved, or sometimes it's more helpful for a person who is not the prophet to correct them because it's important for a particular other person to correct them to form a bond between those two individuals. So let's just say like a husband and wife. Like if a husband and a wife come to the place where they are able to constantly correct each other and rebuke each other when needed, they can form a very special bond through that. And perhaps that's what the person needs more than being corrected by a prophet. So, yeah, there are lots of reasons why it could be done differently. Another reason why it's often, preferable for a prophet not to have to correct someone is because prophets have a lot to do. Mm-hmm. And it's a very unfortunate thing that often prophets have had so much time taken up in rebuking people when they could be teaching the various principles of the message which they are given to bear to those who aren't in as much need of rebuke. And so, yeah, it's definitely, sometimes it's necessary, but it would be far better, of course, if prophets didn't have to rebuke anyone mm-hmm. and were able to just illuminate on fresh points.
One thing before the conversation takes any angle or turn away from this aspect, I also just wanted to bring out how the word rebuke sometimes can be perceived differently than what you're using it as. To me, at least, the word rebuke tends to carry a more negative connotation than the word correction. And if a person heard you saying, if I give you a rebuke, that's to be understood as being a part of the message and divinely inspired and that sort of thing. Well, so they'll be like, okay, well, I'll keep my eyes and ears open for that, right? So then let's say they receive a rebuke, but it's done in such a way that to them doesn't really seem harsh or too exacting or whatever, and they're thinking, oh, that's just a slight correction, so that's just Trent's idea or opinion. That's not the same as a rebuke. That's not the same as being inspired by God, right? I could easily see that happening.
I'm so glad that you're mentioning this. Yes, I could easily see that happening as well.
Yeah, but any correction of whatever,
behavior,
yes.
Thoughts, whatever.
Perfect. Yes, thank you. I was like searching for the words again. Any correction in behavior, thoughts, or like some misunderstanding of the message or whatever, that is to be understood as from inspiration when it comes from you. Yeah.
And that would be for your counsel as well. So just not only are your rebukes or corrections inspired, but your counsels as well.
Yes, so any counsel that I give is part of the message. And so again, like that, it's to be tested as part of the message. But what I'll say is so very important. The reason why I started with mentioning rebukes, and yes, I think it is entirely proper to extend that to correction if someone doesn't view them as synonymous. The reason why I started with that is because that's the area where people are so likely often to reject that correction or that reproof as being just the opinion of the prophet. And what is so important to do is to recognize that if you are receiving any sort of correction or reproof or rebuke and you feel resistance to it, or even if you honestly just can't see it, like you just don't see that this is necessary or that the correction is true, whether you think it doesn't apply or whether you think that it's just incorrect, like no, actually, I'm correct on this, and what you're saying is incorrect. What is so important to keep in mind is that on the subject that you are being corrected on, you are far more likely to not give a valid investigation to the topic, or you may be sincere, but you are far more likely not to be able to accurately judge the circumstance. So you're being something or corrected on something, well, obviously whatever you had before is something that you either thought or acted as though you thought was correct or at least acceptable. And so for someone to say otherwise, like the very fact of being corrected is showing that you were thinking or acting in a way which is in line with a certain idea to which you hold, and that you didn't see a problem with, at least at the time. So on that subject, yeah, you're likely to not see it, because if you saw it or fully realized it, you wouldn't need the correction. And so it is very important that if someone comes to a point like that, not to test the prophet on that point, for the same reason that people do not, like a judge will not be assigned a case which they have personal interests invested in, because it's very difficult to separate oneself from it and judge it objectively. So if someone comes to a point where they are being corrected on something and they can't see it or they have resistance, do not judge it on that, for the same reason that a judge shouldn't judge a case with personal investment. So when you come to a point, test the message again. Go back to the evidences for the message that are totally separate from that issue. So let's say if I correct you on something and you're having a hard time with it, go back and study the Psalms that we claim find fulfillment in this message. Study Isaiah, study the silver trumpet, study the prophets and the types and everything. Study our claims, the unique claims of the message. Study what we say about justification by faith. Study what we say about the Godhead. Study what we say about all of the topics that are really the unique claims of the message. And if you can find that you can do, let's say, 100 experiments and find that it's true for all of those things, which you can do a far more objective investigation of, then it is your responsibility to go with the weight of evidence of those 100 experiments over the one experiment which you are so subject to be wrong on. Anyway, our phone's going to cut out, hang up and call right back in. Okay, we are back. Thank you for waiting. So I was just explaining how the point upon which someone is being corrected is not the point upon which they should judge the legitimacy of the message or of the correction, because that's the point concerning which they are most likely to have bias. So what the reasonable thing to do is, and anyone, of course, has the freedom to do whatever they want, but the reasonable thing is, in a circumstance like that, what the individual should do is study the points upon which they do not have a particular bias, and be careful not to allow what their bias may be in regard to the other issue to influence those investigations, and especially like if they've already done the investigations without that bias being there. Like, let's say you've tested the message over and over and over again, and you've done your 100, 200, however many experiments, and you can see, yes, the message is correct on its unique points. The reasonable thing to do is to acknowledge the truth of the message on the point at which it reproves you, even if you yourself do not see it yet, because your only other option would be to ignore all of those experiments that you've done to verify the message, to toss that aside, just because you cannot see this one point. Now, that's even worse than siding with one experiment against 100, because your experiment in that instance hasn't even shown. But let's say you do an experiment and you think, oh, no, the prophet's wrong on this point where I'm being reproved. Again, how likely is that when you most likely have a bias on that, if you can show them to be true on all these other things? So, again, the direction that, like, it's just really important to realize that what that's about, like what I'm saying right now, this particular counsel is simply pointing out what makes sense. Like, anyone of any belief system, anyone in the world, in science, whatever it may be, everyone recognizes that you go for the weight of evidence. You go for the 100 experiments over the one. That just makes sense. And so that's the counsel, because too often people have tossed out their 100 experiments because they won't accept a reproof or a correction. And that's so not valid, especially when they've acknowledged the message and the message says, thou art wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked.
And don't even know it.
And don't even know it. Exactly. So this, what I'm saying right now, is just a further explanation of what Ellen White says in Testimonies 5 in a section called How to Receive Reproof.
It's in the nature and influence of the testimonies.
Yes. A very important section. But I know that some have misinterpreted what Ellen White has said there, because she says, having acknowledged the message to be true, it is the duty of the individual to receive the reproof. And so basically some have interpreted that as though Ellen White is saying, just because you acknowledge something as true, or just because you say something's true once, means that you never get to question it from that point. And that's not at all what she's saying. In fact, she constantly advocates questioning our current positions and not thinking that we're right on everything and all of that. She says to not set our stakes and so on and so forth. All she's saying, again, the whole context is how to receive reproof. And what she's saying is, don't test the message on the point of your bias. And if you have done the experiments and demonstrated the message to be true already, don't toss out all of that evidence just because you're being reproved and, are blind to the need of it. Well, yeah, I mean, if you've seen that the message is true, then you should see that it's very likely that you're blind to at least some aspects of who you are. So she's advocating for consistency and for valid experiments, not rashly dismissing evidence in favor of a bias. So anyway, I hope that helps more.
I have a question.
Sure.
So when you rebuke a certain individual, how Sister White would say, I was shown in vision, or would you always, or not always, say that our Heavenly Family told you, or our sister has shown me that you are blah, 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 or you just, is that going to be a tendency of yours so that an individual could, how do I say this? And an individual could verify that, is it just your opinion, or is it truly, inspired and from our Heavenly Family?
No, I will not always say I was shown or whatever it may be. In fact, it is often better for someone initially to be given counsel more subtly. And the thing is, and people often think that Ellen White said I was shown like all the time, and she really didn't. In fact, a lot of the time when she gave reproof, she just gave the reproof. She didn't say I was shown all the time. It's just that we have so much writing from Ellen White that we have so many occurrences of her saying I was shown. But often when she reproved people, she would just give the reproof. And the reason why she didn't always say I was shown is the same reason why I don't always say I was shown. And that is that people often give in to a certain temptation where they feel that they are being forced or pressured or something like that if something is stated definitively, or, hey, this is from divine inspiration. Because sometimes if someone's told this is from divine inspiration in a very straightforward way, then they are tempted to think, oh, so I just have to take your word for it or else.
Or I'm in open rebellion against the message or something.
Yeah, exactly. And when that's not at all the case, it's just the fact that, hey, if someone needs reproof on something and our Heavenly Family has to convey that to them, they have to convey it in some way because they love them. And at times it is the best thing to say, hey, this is, by divine inspiration, like I was shown this, in order to draw the person to realize the seriousness of this, that it is really, this is part of the message, and you have to weigh it with that amount of gravity. But often it's not because a person, often it won't be stated in those terms in order to allow the person to not be subjected to that temptation, at least not to as great a degree, and to kind of like our Heavenly Family likes reasoning with people, right? Like they like for the people to come to see that this is really the case. Like even though someone may receive a reproof and not see that it's the case due to blindness, ideally our Heavenly Family would like them to actually see that yes, this is the case, and yes, they are in need of this reproof, and so on. So our Heavenly Family will often send their messengers to go about it more subtly and to offer, gentle reproof or correction or reminders on things or whatever. But often what happens is when our Heavenly Family does that more subtle approach, then, as Teresa was pointing out, it doesn't come across as big of a deal or as serious, and so they think, oh, this is just their opinion, this isn't the counsel of our Heavenly Family. And so then the prophet will have to state things a little more seriously, or whatever it may be. And so as many times as a person may be corrected and not receive the correction, then basically the degree of emphasis, the degree of seriousness, and all of that will increase in order to draw the person's attention more directly to the reality of the correction. And even then, a person may end up forgetting or brushing aside all of the gentle, more subtle attempts to correct, and still accuse the person of being too forceful or whatever it may be. But so there's a spectrum, there's a range of directness and of seriousness and of emphasis.
First, I have a comment, but first I'll make sure that Anna's question is all good.
It's good.
Excellent.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this aspect, this conversation is very, very interesting to me, probably because I'm so tuned in to the Testimonies for the Church. And I have been making, for the past almost 3 years, I have been making understanding the testimonies a big part of my spiritual growth, and at least an attempt to understand them, because I knew that I needed it so much and that it's such an important part of the work. So as we're discussing all of this, one of the other aspects that came to my mind as I'm listening, this actually came out to a degree in a recent meeting. It was either Tuesday night or Wednesday night. It was either a Testimonies meeting or a Silver Trumpet meeting. Where it was, okay, I remember. It was the Tuesday night Testimonies meeting. And so the point is that people have a tendency to, when they're faced with a wrong that they've committed and they recognize, oh, that was wrong, our tendency is to just, when enough time goes by, we just let it go. We don't actually make the point or effort to confess our wrong in whatever appropriate degree it might be and openly repent. And Ellen White emphasizes in the Testimonies how wrong that is, and that it shows that we don't actually have remorse for what we've done, and that we can't be forgiven. Like, it's a really big deal. Mm-hmm. And it will also skew our perception of righteousness, because we'll convince ourselves that what we did wasn't really that bad. So with a more subtle correction could also come that aspect of not just, the possibility of thinking, well, that's not even inspired, that's just your opinion. There could be an aspect of, well, yeah, I'm not saying that's just your opinion or anything, but, obviously, and they're not speaking this to you, of course, they're just thinking it.
Or speaking it even.
Well, or speaking it, sure. Yeah. But what I was about to say, I don't think they would speak. Right. But, we might think, well, obviously it's not something that I did that's really, really bad. It was just a gentle, subtle thing, so it doesn't really require open confession and repentance to the appropriate degree, always.
Or, oh, yeah, what I did was wrong, but I had sincere intentions, I had good motives, I didn't mean anything bad by it, so it's not as bad.
Right, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point, because often people do lessen the seriousness of their sins and the seriousness with corrections they need to make and all of that, because of their potentially real sincerity. Like, someone may have been very sincere, or maybe they did have no negative intentions or whatever, but that does not actually diminish the severity of the sin and the consequences of the sin and the promptness and action required in order to correct it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, this is, I can see more and more so how vitally important this is for us to understand, and how much we would benefit if each of us as individuals did really understand it and then act it out. Because if we acted it out, we would, by that, And by acting it out, I mean that open confession and repentance. If we did that every time we became aware of wronging someone, then it would be more on the radar to identify wrong behavior before we actually commit it. It might just be that temptation point, and then we can recognize, oh, wait a second, this is what happens just before I do thus or so, and I know where that leads and what that does, and then you can, have a little bit of that extra moment to decide what you're actually going to do. And I can see that bringing so much victory if we are just willing to, number one, view things the way they really are, not try to diminish our wrongs, and not allow pride to get in the way of just confessing and asking for forgiveness, both of whomever you may have wronged and our Heavenly Family, because certainly wronged them, right? So, yeah, we would have a huge spiritual growth, and that would bring about a unity that would be unbreakable. And then
Amen.
The family would, yes, and then our Heavenly Family would be able to use us in such a more powerful way. And then this work would be wrapped up, and then we're in the kingdom, and then sin's being put to an end, and then it's all done.
And then everlasting progress.
Amen.
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 That's why this is part of the testimonies for the church are part of the third angel's message.
Amen.
Thank you, Heavenly Family.
Okay, so I have been absolutely blessed by this conversation.
Me too.
And I think that's a really good point to end on. And so I'm thinking we can end on this. If anyone has any further comments or questions along these lines, maybe write it down, or if you'll remember it, that's good, and we can continue it tomorrow night. But I know, we've been on for almost 2 hours now, so I think it'll be good for us to end the meeting. So that said, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family before we close?
I will. Heavenly Family, I thank you so much for providing us with a firm foundation of the only sure way really to protect ourselves from the Laodicean condition of honest deception. And there's just no other way. Every other way is sinking sand. So I just praise you, Heavenly Family, for giving us that firm foundation. I pray your hand of blessing upon Trent and Teresa and everyone investigating this message and in this message. And I just thank you for each and every one of us. And I pray that that you would be blessed tomorrow by our work for you, and hand of blessing upon all of us. In the name of the branch and sheep. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Toda Elohenu. All right, love you all. Have a good night.
Shabbat shalom.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.